This Georgia Department of Education screencast is intended to provide teachers of 5th grade social studies with the content knowledge to aid in the teaching of the Georgia Standards of Excellence. In this screencast, we will briefly review the investment behaviors of the 1920s that led to the stock market crash, which didn't precisely cause the Great Depression, but was certainly a major contributing factor. We will also look at the two very different approaches to the crisis of the Hoover administration and the Roosevelt administration, including a closer look at 3 of the many alphabet soup agencies, the CCC, the WPA, and the TVA, that were the hallmarks of Roosevelt's New Deal. If you are interested in a more in-depth look at the economic causes of the stock market crash, you may want to check out the screencast for the 5th grade economic standards SS5E2 and 3, as that screencast covers the interactions between the 4 sectors of the economy that were partially responsible for the crash.
To quickly review, however, the economic boom of the 1920s led inexperienced people to invest unwisely in the stock market, and with money they could not afford to lose, trying to cash in on all that prosperity. This prosperity fueled a great deal of growth and led many businesses to expand a bit too quickly. When all of this growth slowed down, as it must at some point, and some businesses even had to scale back, stock prices dropped, and these inexperienced investors panicked and began selling their stocks, which in turn spurred others to do the same, resulting in an out-of-control crash of the stock market, which triggered a run on the banks, bringing the national economy to a grinding halt in what became known as the Great Depression. Despite today's economic trials and tribulations, Americans enjoy a relatively high quality of life, and so our students may have trouble relating to what life would have been like during the Depression. Certainly some of our students unfortunately experienced devastating poverty, but this was a time when huge numbers of families experienced total economic ruin, families that were accustomed to relative prosperity. Men who had been raised to perceive their self-worth by their ability to provide for their families suddenly found themselves out of work and unable to get a job despite their abilities because jobs simply were not available. What businesses survived had to cut back drastically in order to continue to do so. Production of goods in the United States dropped by half. With lower production, fewer workers were needed, but that also means lower sales, and sales are what drive the economy. The unemployment rate of 3.2% in 1929 rose to a catastrophic 24.9% in 1933. A quarter of our nation was unemployed, and this at a time where that one person was the sole support of the entire family. To add to all of this misery, the Great Plains region experienced an extreme drought that turned the teeming grasslands into an arid wasteland. Grain crops such as wheat and oats are essentially grasses, and so they grow quite well in the Great Plains, but do not have the deeper root systems of the native grasses. Not only that, but the same industrial revolution that brought us the car and the airplane brought mechanization to harvesting in the form of the combine. This, in combination with an increased demand for wheat and other crops brought about by World War I, had encouraged farmers to greatly increase production and borrow money to increase the size of their farms. So farmers plowed up the native grasses that had deeper roots and could survive the arid conditions and replaced it with food crops that were not native to the area. When the droughts came and the wheat died, there was no vegetation to hold the soil to the ground, and the region began to experience the first of many large and violent dust storms that engulfed the plains and blotted out the sun. Many farmers, already deeply in debt, folded under the pressure. Over 60% of the population of the plains gave up farming and fled to the cities hoping to find work. But of course there was none there to be had, and most ended up on the streets. Many charities stepped in to try to offer aid and a hot meal to these newly homeless Americans, and so the 1930s saw the rise of the soup kitchen. Soup kitchens pretty much do what the name suggests. They provide a meal of soup and a hunk of bread 3 times a day to the growing number of unemployed and their families. Surprisingly, one of the very first soup kitchens was opened by notorious gangster Al Capone. As the numbers of homeless and unemployed grew beyond what the charities could support, the federal government stepped in and began operating soup kitchens in nearly every city in the country. President Hoover and his administration tried to bolster the economy through the banking system with the Banking Act of 1932. The idea was that by loaning banks money, it would keep them afloat, and they would then loan money to businesses which would then be able to rehire employees, driving up production and sales and so forth. Some have argued that it was too little too late. In any case, many of the banks still continued to fail, and businesses were wary of hiring or even borrowing while things were still so bad and consumers weren't spending. Another factor that played into Hoover's policies was that his was a Republican administration, and Hoover and his fellow Republican advisors as a whole subscribed to the predominant economic theories of the time that said that in a free market system, supply, demand, and competition will ensure that the economy will balance itself, and that it is best for the government to not interfere. There will naturally be cyclical rises and falls, but the system as a whole will seek equilibrium. Republicans in general already felt that government should be as small as possible and should try to stay out of people's lives as much as possible. And so, though they did intervene in some places, for the most part they kept a hands-off approach, knowing that the market would eventually begin to recover on its own. And while economists to this day still argue whether Hoover was right or not, that did not stop the millions of Americans who had been evicted from their homes and were living in the makeshift shanty towns that had cropped up on the edges of many cities from blaming him. As more and more families lost their homes and had nowhere to go, they gathered in vacant lots and built shelters out of scraps of wood and canvas. These communities became known as Hoovervilles because they felt that President Hoover was responsible for their existence. Despite this lack of popularity, Hoover ran for re-election and lost in a landslide to Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whom was often referred to by his initials FDR. Roosevelt blamed Hoover for not doing enough to end the suffering and promised Americans a New Deal. It was in his inaugural address that he uttered the infamous, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," and likened the Depression to a war we were waging, his New Deal to a battle plan that would bring victory. The New Deal was a series of programs designed to support the failing bank systems and get people back to work. The thinking was that as people got back to work and started making money again, they would begin to feel confident in spending again, because no amount of production helps a business if people simply can't afford to buy what you are making. And as spending increased, businesses would gain the confidence to hire and produce, which would begin the whole process of economic recovery. One of the very first things President Roosevelt did was close the banks for a 4-day holiday to stop the runs on the bank. You can't take your money out of the bank if it isn't open. This was the first in a long series of acts that were often shortened to the first letters of their names. For example, the Tennessee Valley Authority Act became known as the TVA, and the Works Progress Administration Act became the WPA, and so forth. Collectively, they were often humorously referred to as FDR's alphabet soup. While the New Deal brought us many Depression-era programs, many of which still exist today, our standard asks us to look specifically at 3: the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, and the Tennessee Valley Authority. Roosevelt had always been an avid outdoorsman and believed strongly in the conservation of our natural resources. So he saw this as an area where he could put young men to work at jobs mostly in the forests, where they would not interfere with the job markets in urban or even rural areas. The program was only in operation for 9 years, from 1933 to 1942, but during that time it employed over 3 million young men, keeping them off the streets while relieving some of the burden on their families.